Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Randy Bach, and today we are in December. I was pointing out that December actually means the 10th month, yet it's the 12th month, and we're all screwed up by July and August. Um, but we could use those, two months, July and August, right about now, at least here in the Northern Hemisphere. I'm honored today to have Hugh McCarthy with us. And I met him previously at Panda, which is pandata.org, and he lectured yesterday. He's an educator, head teacher, as they say in Northern Ireland, headmaster, principal, however you want to say it. And his interest is, is for the children. I mean, there's kind of a trope or meme, what about the children? People are always protesting and so forth. And yet, that should be our main concern. Children are our future. They're our future caregivers and caretakers. And I think, and Mr. McCarthy makes a very good case that we have, in a sense, done them wrong. I'm going to let Mr. McCarthy further introduce himself and discuss in what manner and in ways that might have actually occurred.
Hello, everybody. Hugh here. Yes, I'm from Northern Ireland. I'm retired. Been retired for a few years now. I've been in education for 50 years. I probably look like that. The children have largely been a pleasure. In my job, it was the adults who gave me most of the headaches, I have to say. I was privileged to work with very professional colleagues. All schools and systems are, of course, different. I suppose I rather thought ours worked largely very well. The children certainly appeared somewhat happy at school. I'm not saying they didn't want the summer holidays, and of course the teachers did too. Right from the start, I felt this was wrong. Morally, I thought it was wrong. And I was encouraged. My wife felt the same way, and various family members felt the same way. Not my closest family, regrettably, actually. But to close businesses, to separate people, to close schools, to mask children, it seemed to me that unless this was desperately deadly, such as a nuclear warhead, then what are we doing? Where is the science? So initially we opposed it because it was morally wrong. Then, as a blessing, I guess, the science lined up. And right from the start, there was a group of scientists who provided what we saw as independent, sensible science that made sense. And they weren't ramming it down our throat, so to speak. They were explaining and showing the science behind their decision. I think of Michael Levitt, John Lee, Ivor Cummings, Joel Smalley, Nick Hudson, and later on another bunch. And I was reassured by them that in my representative role, the councils I sat on, I represented children. So I was trying to make decisions for other people's children. So I had to be right. If I was putting them or seeking to put them in harm's way, then I had to be doubly sure that I was right. So after a lot of investigation, as I said, into independent science, it became clear to me that masking, PCR tests were not working and that they weren't necessary. I think the evidence was clear right from the start, right from Italy, that this was a very age-specific illness, over 80s, in fact, and that the children were not affected. And that meant that the vast majority of school teachers weren't affected either, actually, since they're mostly under 40 or 45. So I began opposing it through the board that I was on and through newspaper articles. So I was fortunate that one of our local newspapers published a whole series of my articles, actually, 11. And then I started making propositions to one of our councils. It was responsible for 49% of our schools, actually, in Northern Ireland's education system, which is historically based. And frankly, was getting nowhere, and got nowhere, actually. So, and Northern Ireland is still, to a certain degree, bound up with the belief that the virus was deadly, it was easily transmissible, that the PCR test was reliable, and that masks worked. And I suppose it's fair to say that I wouldn't call it a campaign, but I've certainly sought to explain the science to anybody who would listen. So in my case, this meant I'm still in good terms with the chief executives of the councils I sit on. So they receive my material on a weekly basis, the science actually, on a weekly basis with commentaries. I also send the same material to leading politicians, some of whom I taught, and to the medical fraternity. Now, it can be a chastening experience, I have to say. But once you're there, what else can you do? I've kept doing it. So I'll pause there, Randall, if you want.
Were you treated respectfully, disdainfully? And I just want to make one minor note that even before Italy, there was the Diamond Princess.
Yes, indeed.
And the data were there right from, China did not release adequate data. So they're partly culpable for being both the perpetrators and then kind of the hit and run driver. They hit and they ran. They didn't produce the data. And they, in fact, gave bad data to the WHO. But leaving that aside, the Diamond Princess was as close to a perfect experiment as ever could be. And that showed the kids didn't really have they barely any of them showed positive. And the ones who did show positive didn't have any symptoms. So the kids on this cruise ship didn't have anything. So even before Italy, I think that the data were there, and it's a mystery. But just to kind of get back to your situation, I'd like for our listeners to kind of see the landscape of what it in a sense what it's like to be. I mean, you're not really a whistleblower. You're providing data and sensibilities. Where did you have the data? What kind of data did you present? How was it received? And was it any of it acted upon?
The answer to the last question is no. The answer to the earlier questions was education is a report-based business. Or at least it's supposed to be. We're supposed to act on a whole series of education reports: how to teach, when to teach, what to teach. So I thought that in presenting to my council, I was the director of the council, scientifically based reports on masking, on the PCR tests, and on the infection fatality rates, that these would not be contested. So I would have used tables from work from Professor Carl Heineken, Director of Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford. I'd be in contact with Professor Bhattacharya and Professor Gupta, and they would look over my work. More recently, Professor Enos, whom you know from Edinburgh, David Bell from Pandata, Professor Fenton, risk management. More recently, they have taken an interest in what I've been writing. And Professor Ioannidis has done amazing work on the infection fatality rates. So, for example, in masks, I would have presented graphs sent to me by Ivor Cummings, whom you know, and presented data by Joel Smalley, both of whom are connected with Pandata. But the masks were clear. If masks work, then if infections are running at a certain level, or cases, misnamed cases, but if they're running at a certain level, you put a mask on. You don't need to be a scientist to know that cases would fall. Now, it's blatantly obvious, but apparently not. There were no cases and no evidence that they did in fact fall. Now, I presented research papers, graphs to my board. Got nowhere. I did the same with PCR tests. As you know, Professor Craig says 5,000 particles are necessary, or Dr. Clare, 5,000 particles are necessary for a person to be infected or infectious. We're testing for 4. Is there anyone that doesn't know that the cycle threshold is way too high?
Mm-hmm.
I had a terrible time finding it out from our people what the cycle threshold we were using is.
Yeah.
And then I contested it through one of my boards. Actually, didn't make any difference. I presented the infection fatality rates and early numbers of deaths. So, for example, I knew in Northern Ireland that almost nobody was dying. And I don't mean no children. I mean nobody was dying of COVID. The figures were presented with COVID, not of COVID. I contested this with the newspapers. I contested it at my boards. You asked the question, was I treated with respect? I have to say, by the chair and chief executive, absolutely. I was given the floor. By some of my fellows, something less than, and it was a cold house, I have to say. Everybody can tell when your audience is not with you. And I could certainly tell the coldness, sometimes via Zoom and sometimes in person. Laterally, as we began to meet in person, I had the feeling I was being able to persuade people, but it wasn't sufficient enough to contest the mass media. I think the mass media here has done irreparable damage because nobody believes anything anybody says if it's not on the TV. If the TV is saying something different, it doesn't matter what the science says. And I had an expression, I'll just finish with, I would have asked one of the chief executives whom I'm on coffee terms with to take himself into a dark room, switch off the TV and switch on his brain. Because the evidence is quite clear, in my view, of course. But it's certainly worth considering. And that's what the absence was. There was no consideration of alternative views. I mean, I asked Professor Gupta and indeed David Kuldorf why they weren't on the TV more. And so that was said, couldn't get on.
Yeah.
I myself, I think you know this, was cut off. I was invited on to a BBC radio program here as a reasonably respected head teacher, I think. Certainly a long-serving one, the longest, in fact. Because I had a different view about masks. I was brought on the last couple of minutes, which told its own story. But more or less, no sooner had I started than I was accused of not knowing the science. Now, I have a science degree. The interviewer didn't. And then I was cut off. And that produced a lot of publicity, in fact. So it was counterproductive cutting me off. But
how long ago was that?
Just a few months.
We're not talking in the throes of 2020's panic when people didn't, unaware of the Diamond Princess, and so they didn't, have the better knowledge. But you bring up something interesting about the news. People think the news is what's happening. I'm related to a journalist who went to journalism school and so forth, which may be inimical actually to the task. I think a lot of the great journalists over the years didn't go to journalism school. But he told me that journalism is not about reporting the news. It's about pushing a narrative. And he said that enthusiastically, because he believes that the people need to be moved to a better kind of political place, and it's directional. And I think that the real power of the news oftentimes is exclusionary. It's by choice. It's if you go to a restaurant, you go to an Italian restaurant, you're not going to get Chinese food. You're going to get a certain menu that is promoted and so forth. And certain things can get on the menu and certain things cannot. I think the news does that. So, Jay Bhattacharya, you mentioned, and Sanjit Gupta, they won't get on the news. Their opinions are valid, and they have the data to back it up. But it's a matter of the news, as it were, picks and chooses what it wants to have there. And in your case, somehow you slipped in, but at a certain point you had to be excluded.
Yes, in a sense, I was semi-fortunate. In the Northern Ireland's convoluted political system, one of the larger parties, the politicians, certainly local politicians, were on my wavelength. And I've continued to send them lots of data, and I continue to do so. One of the newspapers also appeared to be largely on our wavelength, my wavelength, and received the articles. What I was constantly appalled at is we weren't talking about the children. I mean, all education bodies, you would think, let's talk about the needs of the children. What do the children need? Educationally, developmentally, socially, psychologically. What is it the children need? Now, as I've repeatedly said, we deny them everything that was there to protect their mental health. If a child is suffering from stress and they go to the doctor will tell them, play sport, meet your mates, socialize, go on holiday, go to school. But what did we do? We denied them everything. Everything. The result is record numbers of children in England. I'm in Northern Ireland now, but record numbers of children in England seeking help for mental health issues. Some 400,000 a month, an all-time record, with 1 million children waiting. Now, some people are looking around and saying, whoa, where did that come from? And it's very difficult to get into a conversation with somebody that starts from there. It came from the policies and practices that the government introduced when it closed schools, stopped sport. I mean, one of the big releases for many children is sport. Now, a group of healthy children running about outside, kicking a ball. So parks closed. Now, there is absolutely no evidence that children are affected by this. Professor Ioannidis' work, 99.9987 survival chance, even if they get it. But you're 10 times more likely to get knocked down in a road accident.
Absolutely.
So no evidence that they get it, no evidence that they transmit it, and no evidence that there's transmission out of doors. But football matches, rugby matches, hockey, running, tennis, everything denied them. Stuck away in their bedrooms, kept away from their friends. I think it was criminal.
It is criminal. It is criminal. The worst punishment, even if you're in prison, which I think all of us were to varying extents, the worst punishment in prison is solitary. The human brain, we like to think of ourselves as atomized individual minds working on something, but we're tribal animals or herd animals, or whatever you want to think of it as, and we identify in consort and conjunction with others.
Yes, and what we did, we've spent years telling them, don't look at screens, come off your computer or off your mobile phone. And then what did we do? We all of a sudden told them to go onto the computer to do your education and socialize with your mates. The exact opposite to what we'd been telling them about the harms of technology.
Yeah.
And as you correctly point out, human beings need to socialize. We denied them an essential need, and put it down to science. And yet I was presenting science that I've just indicated there, actually, about they weren't at risk. They weren't a risk to anybody else. And actually, there are huge harms associated with what we did. And I presented that in meeting 11, actually. I made 11 of these presentations to one of my councils, by more or less by rotation. And ultimately, I proposed that we stop vaccinating children. I then proposed that we stop vaccinating children on school premises, which I saw as coercive. And then I tried to explain why the numbers again, that they didn't need a vaccine, actually.
Yeah, no, I'm with you there. I was in a discussion yesterday with a gentleman. I'll leave his job out of it. And he was asking me this same question about, childhood vaccines and so forth. And I said, look, I love vaccines. As a physician, I've given out thousands, if not tens of thousands of vaccines. I took the flu shot every single year for decades. I think they're awesome. And I believe there's a yellow fever vaccine. And it may be a great vaccine, but I'm not going to take it. I don't give it out to anybody. I don't recommend it, because nobody is in line unless they are of getting yellow fever. If you're going to the Congo or someplace like that, sure, get a yellow fever vaccine. But in the normal concourse of events, going back and forth in Belfast or here, you don't need a yellow fever vaccine. And if there were a subgroup of people who are not affected by that, they shouldn't get it either. There's a vaccine against shingles. I don't give that out to kids. I mean, maybe it's a great vaccine. But kids don't need to get a shingles vaccine. So we have to figure out what it is that, this concept of one size fits all maybe works with muumuus and Mao suits, but it doesn't necessarily work with medicine. I mean, we don't give one size fits all of anything to anybody ever, or to everybody ever.
One should know that everybody's different. So my physiology is different from other people's physiology. I've got strengths and weaknesses. And so it is with people. So the one size doesn't fit all, because people are of different sizes. And therefore, their healthcare should be individualized. And yet here we were. I mean, vaccine passports were iniquitous. And as with mask exemptions, a group of us fought a bit of a campaign to ensure that there were mask exemptions, let alone mask mandates. And I've never worn a mask. And no, it's not been a great place in shops now, I have to tell you. Vaccine passports, we opposed. There was no science support. In fact, any science there was in relation to vaccine passports said they were ineffective. Now, Northern Ireland spent £10 million for a 5-week experiment that didn't work, and then abandoned them. Now, in my view, in private industry, if you make such a mistake, somebody should be held accountable. And yet nobody was. Now, we struggled to get rid of the vaccine passports, but it was like in the Christmas period. And for example, a club that I've been associated with for 60 years couldn't get in. And then when they did open, I wouldn't go in. But one had conversations and discussions, at times heated about it, about the science behind vaccine passports, which of course it was all right for me. I'd had my life, but for young people wanting to socialize in clubs, restaurants, travel, play sport, it was iniquitous.
No.
And this insistence that you could only travel if you're vaccinated, and I contested with one in Northern Ireland system, there are 5 parties. One of the parties holds the health ministry. Now, I taught a few of the people, and I contested very firmly with them about vaccine passports, about the coercive nature of the legislation, which was not accepted, that they were coercing young people. If young people wanted a life, they had to get vaccinated, and they didn't have a choice. It was coercion. And one looks with horror on the damage to children. And the Ofsted report that I've frequently referred to about the lack of development of babies, it came out in spring 2022. Now, Ofsted's the body which inspects and reports on schools in England, and produced what I thought was a seminal report and listed 8 or 9. This is a government report, and it's a government agency. 8 or 9 effects on the development of babies and young children, not the 2. It was appalling in terms of how far they'd fallen behind in their development, in terms of walking, talking, communicating, socializing. Babies that can't walk, talk, crawl. So there are 8 or 9 very serious developmental effects. And then moving up the age range, there was seminal work done by Professor Hill and Dr. Golden of the very well-respected Great Ormond Street Hospital in London, showing that the children were 2 years behind going into primary school. And there's endless research showing that those early years are absolutely crucial. If you don't get the early years, you're behind. Now, research by the New South Wales government showed that 90% of your development takes place in the first 5 years. So to surround children, and in cases in America, put masks on children under 5, and to surround them with mums wearing masks was doing them irreparable damage. Because, as is obvious, young children learn gestures and learn to speak watching gestures, your lip movements. So actually there's the damage is all the way up the age range. So if you're learning to read, you need essential building blocks at about 3 years, 4 years of age. Now, I'm a post-primary, but if you don't get those early building blocks, it's obvious you're going to be behind as you move up the age range. Now, as you move up the age range, there's a thing called functional literacy, which moves beyond the capacity to just read words. You have to be able to read and understand words. Reading the words isn't good enough. Now, in our systems, it's about 86 points. Now, roughly speaking, you're there in 8, 9 years of age. But there are quite a few research papers that show at about 13, very, very difficult, 13 years of age, that is, very, very difficult to teach young people how to read. There's a law of diminishing returns. Now, if you're struggling at 8 and 9, and those are the 2 years, or 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and those are the 2 years schools are closed, you may never learn to read. With all that means for your futures, and indeed for the future of the country. If you do not have a literate workforce, that is very serious indeed. So those children who find reading challenging already, those 2 years were vital, and I'm at a loss to see how they're ever going to be made up, and it's very, very sad.
No, well, my understanding is that the public health officials are going to apologize and give us back 2 years of life.
Yes, quite. Yes,
it's a little bit. My experience is because I didn't actually grow up with it, but the video recorders, they have the rewind button. So my understanding is they're going to rewind to 2019 with the knowledge they have now and just run it all back again and do it correctly. I don't know if you've heard that.
Yeah, well, just going on with what I was saying on the same theme, I noticed that I began to notice, I was supposed to notice these things, but I noticed that the children who were most disruptive and I didn't suspend many children, but I did suspend some. But inevitably, they were male. They were disinterested in education. So I began to look into it, and I did a 3-factor research. We had a behavior record system, and we had obviously ranking orders in classes, and I had reading scores. So you come into the school that I was principal in, I could tell you your reading score and indeed your numeracy score. And almost inevitably, people whose children I was dealing with had a very low reading score, often a year or 2 years behind their chronological age. So just to use age factors, if you're 11 years of age, your reading age should be 11, not 9. So what we found was inevitably those children who had the highest behavioral reports were finishing bottom of their class and had a low reading score. So our answer was to attempt to get into that circle, that cycle, and affect their reading. So collectively, as a school, we decided that if we lift reading scores, those children will find their place in the class and be able to engage in their learning and not feel, shall we say, stupid and not be bottom of the class. They have a chance. So part of our attempt to find a solution was twofold or threefold, really. We used a computerized reading program, an individualized program. And we brought in community readers. We attempted to teach parents within the community how to teach reading. So that they could come in the morning before school starts or break time and lunchtime and indeed after school and be reading tutors.
Right.
And in addition, instead of sending the children home, it's inevitably counterproductive, decided to give them more school, which wasn't terribly popular, but the extra school would be spent reading. And what we tried to do in terms of practicing what we preached, bosses tend to be very good at telling other people what to do. But I participated in these schemes and the teachers were great. A whole bunch of them bought into the program and into tutoring the children. And both the children and their parents could see, well, the school's trying to do something.
Right. That's a caring school in a sense,
Yeah.
and that's a school that is invested in the outcomes. It seems like that was all turned on its head, no?
Well, of course it was. I see schools as now I'm retired, of course, as a jigsaw, whereby if everybody plays their part, or to be more precise, if somebody doesn't play their part, the thing isn't complete. So whatever your strength is, attempt to give it to the children and try to treat the children as if they were your own. Now, of course, some of the teachers did it for the children at the school, so it was easier to use expressions like that. But if you wanted your child to have that experience at school, then give it to the children coming through our doors. And there's a clue in your title, isn't there? You're a teacher. And therefore, your job is to try to teach children, and really you're teaching children those things which they don't already know.
So let me ask you, that's a wonderful model, and I applaud it. It brings up to mind maybe 2 or 3 things, and I'm going to ramble a little bit. I apologize. One is that, it is, you mentioned circularity. There's another circularity, which is that the families of lower social class, economic class, educational class, their kids are likely, parents were both reading and having high level conversations over Sunday dinner or whatever. Their kids don't tend to have the same reading issues. They kind of start from a higher plane. During lockdowns, I think it's been well documented that this kind of gap expanded, that the families of lower socioeconomic / educational, blah, blah, reading levels they wound up even further behind those kids who had parents literate, conversant with the laptop, so forth, better guidance at home, all that kind of stuff. This seems to have been like a big class. You mentioned the word iniquity. This seems to have been a huge unequalizer of outcomes, and that we always pretend not only just to care about the children, but we always want to care about those less fortunate. This seems to have been ultimately a huge slap in the face.
I wholly agree. Anyone who thinks the children you're talking about are often come into this post-primary school disengaged already. Their parents were disengaged because they may not have had a positive experience at school as well. So they're coming into school already somewhat disengaged. Now, those are the very children that need to be engaged with the education process. And schools should attempt to engage them in the school as a community. So not everybody can have a God-given academic gift. Therefore, schools should offer other things to enable them to succeed. It might be singing, it might be making pots, it might be sport, so that they can achieve. Now, in terms of what you're saying, in the real world, children who do not want to work in school with a teacher in front of them, which is challenging at times, as everybody knows, those children aren't going to work at home. That stands to reason. Whether the government gives them a laptop or not, they're not going to work at home, because the start of this was they were disengaged with education in the first place. Mm-hmm. So a school's role is to try to engage them, and you cannot teach children who are disengaged.
Right. I mean, every now and then you'll get a Bobby Fischer, who turned out to be a little bit lunatic in other ways, but somebody who's hugely self-motivated to do a task and becomes, the Bobby Fischer at, in his single-digit years was still, beating masters, and then when he turned teenager, beating grandmasters, and then became a champion. And there are self-motivated kids, but for the most part, it seems to me that if you want your kid to get good at chess or tennis or mathematics, that it has to be in a group. That we have a natural competitive urge, and we measure ourselves against each other. There seems to have been huge layers of cruelty in taking away, playgrounds, locking down, beaches, locking down pools, locking down skate parks at a time when school was out. So there was no social interaction. And then, even now in China, people are being locked up in these, huge towers, and there's the incredible disdain, I think, that our, in this case, China's, elites and so forth, or rulers, and I'm not going to call them elites per se, but they are, I guess, hold the populace in thrall to, some PCR tests or virus counts and so forth, absent, actual detriment to the physical health of the individuals, is topsy-turvy world. I can't really wrap my head around it. I try, and I have these video casts to put it out there, but it's an amazing thing. That wasn't a question. I don't know if you feel like commenting though.
Well, you're quite right. It is almost as if people were shrugging their shoulders and said, it has to be done. I mean, China did it, but the West followed suit. Children were looking at democratic regimes on TV, imprisoning and threatening their citizens. I mean, if that's not enough to scare young people, I quoted a number, about 45% of the children under 18 are scared about the future of their generation. 45%. I think the report was Cosmo, or Social Mobility report. scared about the future of the generation. I'm not a bit surprised they're scared. If they're watching the TV and they're showing democratic regimes threatening and beating up their citizens, that is a scary
Yeah.
world for young people.
From our vantage here, we always, we have these various treaties, and we see kind of the good guy countries from the United States, our long-term allies, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and these are nations that have a flaw. I mean, the only silver lining it's a very bleak silver lining, but the only silver lining I found from all this is that COVID is essentially the canary in the coal mine that tells us that there are weaknesses, there are flaws in parliamentary democracy.
Well, what if I may come in there? One of the things that we've been neglectful of, teaching our children what democracy means.
Mm-hmm.
When you talk about freedom to do what exactly? And what's the converse of freedom? What does a non-democratic country look like? I would have grown up in, I'm obviously older than you, but in terms of the big scare was communism. So I was a young man during, we'll say, the Vietnam War, when there was the domino theory of world domination by communism. So you were well aware in the West that what we had was freedom to associate, freedom of speech, freedom to oppose government, free elections, and that was democratic. A non-democratic country looked a bit like, we'll say, in those days, communist Russia, and these days, perhaps communist China. Well, you didn't have that. So there was democracy set against its opposite. Now, what the younger people have grown up with is there is no opposite to democracy. Not really, not in a real sense, because up until relatively recently, China was way over there, at least for where we are. So I think we have been somewhat neglectful in explaining to our young people about what it means to have a democratic society. Now, I had this issue. I've got 3 sons, all about 30. And having a conversation with them is tricky. But one of the fellows I had a conversation was about freedoms. And it was his perspective on freedom and my perspective on freedom was, his remark was something, you can do what you want. And I said, well, I can do what I want, except only if I wear a mask, get a vaccine. I can't go to church, and I can't travel, and I can't go and watch a football match, and I can't go and drink in the local club. So I'm only free if I do what I'm told, and that's not freedom. And I suppose I sort of stuck there with that. It's a difficult conversation to have within your household. You stimulated, or perhaps I'd like to say it before it should have been in the front of my head. One of the, and I did refer to it earlier, was could we not have, and I did refer to it, concentrated on the needs of the children? Could we not, as a society, have said, this is what the children need? And if it is necessary to protect adults, then put things in place to protect them.
Exactly right.
This was things of precision shielding or focus protection.
Yeah, focus protection. That was the Great Barrington Declaration. Yes. We mentioned Jay Bhattacharya.
I mean, that wasn't, and of course it was ridiculed, and anybody that dared support it was ridiculed. But it was no more and no less than common sense. Protect those who needed protected.
Absolutely. My late mother-in-law passed in April, and we had her downstairs for a decade, and declining health and so forth. And she wanted every vaccine that came along, which is awesome, and that's great. And we facilitated that. We were careful around her, but and she listens to MSNBC. She was, and she had a particular viewpoint, which is kind of doctrinaire opposite of what we've been discussing. But I asked her at a certain point, I said, these lockdowns, I mean, they mean that your granddaughters and grandsons, but, don't get to study, and they don't meet people, and they're going to delay their lives. And is that, in her life on the margins, she was basically nursing home level health. We were the nursing home. And the average life expectancy in a nursing home was about 13 months. And my mother-in-law didn't pass from COVID or with COVID. She passed from, quote unquote, natural causes at 91 years old. But, I when we had this conversation, you have to balance your protection, and we're happy to keep you, happy as a clam, literally like a clam, isolated, insulated, and contented, fed, and all that kind of stuff. But everything that extra that we're doing to surround you with multiple layers is going to affect your grandchildren, and potentially, it didn't happen in her lifetime, but great grandchildren. And she didn't really, it didn't register with her at all. I find that kind of a big break.
Yeah, I could never understand that. In my head, there were slogans in the United Kingdom, including Northern Ireland, like "Don't kill Granny." I don't know if you're familiar with it, but any UK listener will be familiar with this dreadful slogan, "Don't kill Granny." And everything was determined from school children by "Don't kill Granny." So there were signs up and posters up and radio campaigns and TV campaigns, "Don't kill Granny." Now, in my view, first of all, Granny doesn't live with the grandchildren, mostly. But if they did, surely Mum and Granny could have come up with a regime.
Absolutely.
To protect Granny, even if the child was bringing it home.
Absolutely. I mean,
so, and if again we'd started with the needs of the child, we wouldn't have had such a slogan, because what it did was as you well know, placing a very heavy responsibility on children not to hug Granny, not to go and see them when they're sick, not to go into a room, not to meet them at Christmas time. And that was a terrible, terrible.
And mind you, that all the people who claim the science, they ignored the fact that the children. So many times I heard that children are super spreaders. This is diametrically 100%
wrong,
99.99% false. The super spreaders tend to be those who linger, who have their mucus linger in their lungs. So obese people have a harder time clearing a cough. They got more weight, and it's Pickwickian syndrome. I'm not going to get into it, but it's hard. And people who are long-term smokers and elderly. And so these, basically there's a little kind of power diagram you could make, and the super spread is all aggregated towards, the product, the multiplication product of your BMI times your age, factoring in with smoking and so forth. And so the people who, when you get a cold, they always want to getting bronchitis for 2 or 3 weeks, or pneumonia. Those people are the super spreaders. Kids, they have a very small lung capacity, and they clear it really easily, and they're young. They don't have any obstruction. They don't have COPD. They haven't been smoking for decades, all that kind of stuff. And most all of them are not morbidly obese and so forth. And they're not super spreaders. Never, 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 never. And you heard this over and over again. And we're going to be closing in a few minutes, but the experiments such as we were able to do were kind of country by country, and Sweden did lock down the schools, I think, for a very brief time, but they quickly reopened them, and I'm sure you know this and have quoted it, but there was no evidence, there was no incidence of Swedish school teachers kind of dropping like flies from the kids, or vice versa. And they did fine, and I don't think they suffered the same level of social dysfunction that other states have.
I think Professor Wheelhouse, amongst others, have found that there have been no evidence at all of a child transmitting the disease to a teacher. None at all. Of the multi-thousands of transmissions, there hasn't been one single case of that. And to me, that's incredible. And even if it had been transmitted, I come back to the age profile of this, which we referred to at the top of the program. Anybody under, 50, i.e. most of the teaching force, as well as the children, as well as their parents. I mean, we're talking about children of 10 or 11. What age are their parents? So we're talking about a whole double generation who were virtually unaffected. The generation which was affected was 70 plus. My age group, actually, 70 to 80 plus maybe.
Right.
And that was all the evidence. And as you highlighted there, the various, the BMI, but also their environment, their lifestyle, their history. It wasn't just that they were elderly. It was all those other factors that go round. And COVID was, to my understanding, a respiratory pathogen. And I think it was Professor Heineken pointed out that hospitalizations through respiratory pathogens increase by a factor of 5 during September and October when the schools go back. But that is standard. It isn't unusual. And in Northern Ireland, the total number of deaths of COVID, 254. Now, in 2.5 years of a deadly pathogen. The number of deaths from flu over the same period, 0. Now, the number of deaths that you have expected from flu over the same period was 250. So 254 people died of COVID, 0 died from flu, but you've expected 250 to die of flu. Now, that's the whole population. And those figures come from a freedom of information from one of our own government departments. So the government departments knew this. The government departments knew about masks because the Department of Education in England quoted that there was absolutely no evidence that masks were making any difference.
Yeah. Well, I don't want to sound too morbid here, but the Nazis made certain groups wear tags on their clothing. The Jewish yellow star for the Jews, and there were other placards and so forth. The masks are in a sense an applique, a political messaging, oftentimes voluntary, mind you. Here politically, a lot of people will continue to wear a mask to show that they're not politically part of those other horrible liberty, freedom requesting bunch. But I want to put in a positive word for masks. I mean, as a physician, masks are useful if you are yourself ill, potentially. Surgeons wear them over the open surgical field of abdomen, open abdomen, so forth, so that we don't spray our stuff onto them. But as far as passively, when you're breathing in, if you have a mask that is a scuba mask, such as they wear, in the actual high-level isolation labs in Wuhan and whatnot, connected like a bathysphere to the outside world, well, fine. That's a mask that will keep you from getting illness. But otherwise, we're all in this soup, this air. And when you're breathing through the mask, the resistance, you're going to get your air from the least resistance, from the places, all the cracks and crevices and so forth. And it's really ineffectual. It's pointless, ineffectual. And then the absurdity of, I'm sure you've seen this thousands of times, at my congregation, there's some people wearing masks during services, and then at the the luncheon, the reception, whatever, they have the masks off. They're even closer to people than they had been prior. And of course, at restaurants, if you're seated,
you're safe.
This is the virus that only gets
4 feet, is it?
Above 4 feet high.
Yeah.
So all these things happen, and it's just it's all too much. Anyway, so masks do something. Walls do something. Masks do something. They just don't do what they're pretended and intended to do. And again, I think you brought it up really poignantly about the elderly not getting to see their young people because this kind of ramped up fear that they had. My friends mother was she was knowingly in her last year of life. She had a terminal illness, and she had bunches of grandkids, and she and they all refused to see each other, and she was not even let outdoors for the final year. And then with a week or two, a couple of weeks left to live, the mandates changed. So they whatever allowed her to go outside. There's a beautiful, frankly, I made the picture, actually made me cry literally, of her kind of absorbing the sunlight, as if freed and so forth. But and that's a beautiful picture, but you didn't have to go through all that. There was all the joy was there, and she had that one beautiful, glorious day, and the grandkids came to visit her in the sunlight. But it didn't have to be that way. Every day, could have been a joy, but every day was suffering.
Our care homes were similar, absolutely, in my view. Well, scientifically, disgraceful. And going forward, I guess one of my concerns, and this is off the subject a bit, the finance, the people, and the philosophy who did this to us are by and large still in place in those countries that you named.
Yeah.
And it does concern me that certainly in the UK, opposition political parties, they seem the same way. The only thing that's coming out is, no, we should have locked down harder, sooner, longer. Doesn't matter whether it worked or not. I mean, originally, what was it? 3 weeks to flatten the curve to save the NHS. Right. What happened to that? Why was nobody saying, well, you said this was 3 weeks to save the NHS. What happened to that? What science could there possibly be that a lockdown imposes a virus? I just don't understand that at all, and I don't understand why anybody would think.
They not only took the virus from China, they took some of the worst ideas, and you can see how these ideas are playing out in China now. So we're going to close now, and I'd like you to have the last word. I do want to make one observation, which is kind of the retired part. I mean, I think a lot of the the Cassandras, the truth tellers, have been those who are retired. So I don't know if you can maybe talk about courage within your job. I mean, it just seems that people don't want to stick their necks out and so forth. And there's a lot of kind of group mentality and group think. Anyway, so I'm going to give you like a minute or two to close, and then we'll close.
Okay, thanks, Ron. It has disappointed me, and I've told people that the number of people that have supported me from my own profession been non-existent. I expected after those newspaper articles, a major newspaper here, I expected there to be a groundswell of somebody might say he's right, or he's worth considering, or is worth thinking about. And after all the research documents and presentations I made to one of my boards, I thought somebody might have thought, well, let's look into this. We're a research organization, actually. Let's research it and see whether we agree. And I would have thought, I expected retired head teachers, some of whom do support me, I have to say, retired education civil servants, inspectors, whatever. I expected there to be somebody
Right.
who would. Happen. I didn't.
It's a sadness. I've experienced very much the same. Anyway, I want to thank you for being on our show, for showing the bravery and the foresight. And I think your science degree has really borne fruit, unlike many of others. Anyway, I'm going to end, as I often do, with a shameless self-promotion. This is my book. Hugh McCarthy. I'm going to link his Substack. I'd like you to all go out and buy Overturning Zika, which is the last great pandemic. There's a lot of lessons for what happened here, and it's kind of an isolated, kind of finished case to a great extent, so I think it'd be very edifying. Mr. McCarthy, you can stay on for a minute. We're going to say goodbye to everybody else. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome.